McDermott. And in this video, we're going to take a look at two campaigns, which upon completion allowed the Federals to begin an invasion of the Deep South. But first, following the Second Battle of Murfreesboro, also known as the Battle of Stones River, Confederate General Braxton Bragg was forced to pull back to reinforce the city of Chattanooga, a strategically important rail center on the south side of the Tennessee River. General William Rosecrans, his Federal opponent, maneuvered the Confederates across the river and then prepared to cross his own army and continue offensive operations. The Federals closed on the river, and while demonstrating north of the city of Chattanooga, they put two pontoon bridges, one of them 1,250 feet long and the other 2,700 feet in length, across the Tennessee River farther to the south. General Rosecrans then had his troops across and was preparing to swing to the north and force the Confederates to retreat by cutting their supply lines. The Federal advance was channeled by a series of high ridges with very few crossroads, forcing them to use three roughly parallel valley roads. Calling for reinforcements, Confederate General Bragg evacuated the city of Chattanooga and concentrated his troops 20 miles farther south in preparation for battle. Hearing that Chattanooga had been evacuated, the Federal commander drew the erroneous conclusion that the rebels were retreating, and he pressed forward with the result that his two flank columns began to diverge because of the topography and were soon 40 miles apart and unable to provide mutual support. General Bragg realized he was being given an opportunity to defeat the Federals in detail. If successful, that would allow him to reoccupy Chattanooga. But he was unable to concentrate his forces to take advantage of the situation, and the Federals moved into and took possession of the city. That Federal army of 60,000 men then moved farther south, about 15 miles, and began entrenching on Chickamauga Creek. Confederate General Bragg, with an army of roughly the same size, that is about 60,000 men, planned to begin the fight by turning the Union left flank, a maneuver requiring his men to cross that creek, Chickamauga Creek, at several locations. Rebel troops pushed back Federal pickets and crossed the creek. Hostilities started the next morning when Union troops attacked a rebel brigade. During the morning, more and more units were fed into the battle as divisions began arriving and going into action. Federal strength soon made it clear the Confederate attack had not succeeded, and by nightfall, the fighting began to sputter out. The day's action had identified the Confederate main attack, however, and the Federal Army repositioned in preparation for the next day. The following morning, the Confederates assaulted the Union left flank with the intention of pushing General Rosecrans away from several possible retreat routes. The attack started late, they were piecemeal, and they were stalled by midday. But the action had caused much concern among Union leaders. Confusing orders were issued and troops in defensive positions were moved and not replaced. An area on the right of the Union line was left undefended, just as a massive Confederate attack was launched in that very area. Despite stubborn resistance by some Union troops and desperate counterattacks by others, that portion of the Federal line collapsed. Other units then joined the Federal commander in a frantic retreat toward Chattanooga. Union General George Thomas's 22,000-man corps continued to stand fast, and he was then ordered to serve as the Army's rear guard. Occupying a strong position centered on Horseshoe Ridge, individuals and units who had been in retreat stopped running and joined the defense to hold off repeated Confederate assaults, and they didn't pull back until nightfall. General Thomas' personal demonstration to defend that position until ordered to disengage while his commander and the rest of the army fled earned him the nickname of the Rock of Chickamauga. The final withdrawal to the rear inadvertently left 3 Union infantry regiments to fight on, isolated, until they were surrounded and forced to surrender. After pausing to police the battlefield, the Confederates moved onto high ground, dominating the Tennessee River and the railroads into Chattanooga. When General Rosecrans was unable to break that Confederate siege, he was relieved of command and replaced by General Thomas. Casualties were the highest for any battle fought in the Western Department, with 16,170 Union and 18,454 Confederate soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. One of President Lincoln's brothers-in-law, in fact, a Confederate general named Ben Helm, was among those killed during the battle. Confederate Colonel William Oates recorded his observations as the rebels broke through the Federal line on the second day of the battle. And he wrote, "Union troops were behind the trunks of trees felled the night previously and kept up a lively fire. Our division, in advancing to the front, passed the spot where General Bragg was seated upon his horse. He looked pale and careworn. The enemy seems to be fighting in detached battles. The men rush over the hastily constructed breastworks with the old-time familiar rebel yell, and wheeling then to the right, the column sweeps the enemy before it and pushes along the Chattanooga road toward Missionary Ridge in pursuit. It is glorious." The action was also described by Confederate General D.H. Hill, and he wrote, "I have never seen the Federal dead lie so thickly on the ground, save in front of the sunken wall at Fredericksburg. One of our men was lying alone in the woods, his head partly supported by a tree. He belonged to von Zinken's regiment of New Orleans, which was composed of French, German, and Irish troops. I said to him, 'What regiment do you belong to?' And he replied, 'The 5th Confederate, and a damned good regiment it is.' Another of his desperately wounded Irishmen cried out to his companions, 'Charge 'em, boys, charge 'em. They've got cheese in their haversacks.'" These were hungry Confederates who were ransacking through the Union soldiers' gear once they could get at them. Federal General Rosecrans was bottled up in Chattanooga at the end of a tenuous supply line. President Lincoln attempted to bolster his morale by sending a message that read in part, "Be of good cheer. We have unabated confidence in you and your soldiers and your officers. You must be the judge as to what is to be done. If I was to suggest, however, I would say, save your army by taking strong positions." Privately, however, the president told his secretary, John Hay, that General Rosecrans seemed confused and stunned, like a duck that had been hit on the head. And that closed the Battle of Chickamauga. The Chattanooga campaign was a series of maneuvers and battles that took place in October and November of 1863. More specifically, the attacks to seize Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge occurred from the 23rd to the 25th of November. Winning those actions was necessary to secure the rail and river communications and force the Confederates protecting the rail line south to Atlanta onto the defensive. The rebels held the high ground on Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge and controlled all river and rail traffic into Chattanooga. Federal troops in the city were dependent on a single supply line known as the Cracker Line, a tortuous 60-mile-long mountainous road. Heavy rains in late September washed away sections of the road, and it was also continuously threatened by Confederate cavalry raids. In one case, many of the 800 wagons in a supply train were burned, and the mules were destroyed by rebel cavalry. The situation in Chattanooga soon became grim, with troops on short rations and horses and mules becoming part of the menu after dying for lack of forage. In the meantime, General Grant had been appointed commander of a newly created military division of the Mississippi, which included all of the territory from the Appalachian Mountains west to the Mississippi River. He was also ordered to transfer 20,000 men from Vicksburg, now that it had been captured, to Chattanooga to join other reinforcements and to go there himself and take command. The Army's chief engineer suggested the supply problem could be improved by seizing a place called Brown's Ferry, located downriver and outside rebel control. Union boats could then bring supplies to that point, thus improving the supply situation. The much shortened Cracker Line soon showed positive results. General William Sherman was delayed arriving with the last federal reinforcements because of heavy rains and washed out bridges. But upon his arrival, his troops went into position on the Union left with orders to attack the very next day. Their assault on Tunnel Hill was stalled, while an attack on the right succeeded in taking Confederate positions on Lookout Mountain. That particular fight, sometimes known as the Battle Above the Clouds, forced the rebels to extend their lines on Missionary Ridge and set the stage for subsequent operations. General Grant's plan was a double envelopment, reinforcing the attacks on both left and right. Both of those efforts became bogged down, and in mid-afternoon, he ordered federal troops in the center to seize the first line of Confederate trenches at the foot of Missionary Ridge. This was soon accomplished, and the troops then pressed on without orders, beginning to climb the ridge. To the surprise of all, the rebel defenders began to withdraw as the Union troops scrambled up the slope. A Confederate retreat then began, which took General Bragg and his Confederate army south into Georgia. Their departure paved the way for General Sherman's follow-on campaign, which advanced down the Western and Atlantic Railroad, eventually seizing Atlanta. Federal casualties at Chattanooga numbered 5,824 soldiers, and the Confederate casualties totaled 6,667 men. Union correspondent B.F. Taylor described his observations during the battle for Missionary Ridge. And he wrote, "Men go down here and there before your eyes. The wind lifts and smoke drifts away. And so through the fringe of woods went the line. Now, out into the open country they burst. The tempest that now broke upon their heads was terrible. The enemy's fire burst out of the rifle pits from base to summit of Missionary Ridge. 5 rebel batteries opened along the crest. Grape and canister and shell sowed the ground with iron, and the wounded and the dead. But steady and strong our columns moved on." Taylor then continued his description after he was able to climb the ridge himself. Dead rebels lay thick upon the ridge. Scabbards, broken arms, artillery horses, wrecks of gun carriages, bloody garments strewed the scene. Boys in blue are laying there too. A little drummer boy, his pale face upward, a blue spot on his chest. During the battle, Confederate resupply was as miserable as it had been for the Federals. Sam Watkins, assigned to the 1st Tennessee Infantry Regiment, recounted several reasons why rebel morale was so low. He later wrote, "Our rations were cooked up by a special detail 10 miles in the rear and sent to us every 3 days. And then those 3 days' rations were generally eaten in one meal. and the soldiers then starved for another 2.5 days. The men looked sick, hollow-eyed, and heartbroken. At the very height of our privation and hunger, when the Army was most dissatisfied and unhappy, we were ordered into line to be reviewed by the Honorable Jefferson Davis. When he passed us with his great retinue of staff officers at full gallop, cheers greeted him with the words, "Send us something to eat, Massa Jeff. I'm hungry. I'm hungry." General Bragg later wrote, "No satisfactory excuse can possibly be given for the shameful conduct of our troops in allowing their line to be penetrated. The position was one which ought to have been held by a line of skirmishers against any assaulting column. Only one possible reason presents itself to my mind in explanation of this bad conduct in veteran troops who never before failed in any duty assigned them, however difficult or hazardous. They had for 2 days confronted the enemy, marshaling his immense force in plain view and exhibiting to their sight a superiority of numbers. But our veterans had so often encountered similar hosts when the strength of position was against us, and with perfect success, that not a single doubt crossed my mind." And thus ended the battle for the key city of Chattanooga, opening an avenue of approach for the Federal Army to continue driving south into the Confederacy. Thanks for watching. Please comment as deems appropriate. And until the next video, God bless America.